Everyone here knows what Cthulhu is, right? I mean, he is the Godzilla of the literary world. H.P. Lovecraft is considered a master of American horror for his collections of short stories, most having to do with Cthulhu. He developed an elaborate mythology involving ancient, evil, godlike aliens that secretly have great power over our world, and the evil cults that threaten to channel their evil and cause it to destroy our human illusions of peace and civility. The Western perception of cosmic forces is largely rooted in Abrahamic religious mythology, with the figures of God and Satan, an embodiment of goodness that battles with and will ultimately be triumphant over an embodiment of evil. Lovecraft puts forward a world where there is no God to have our backs, and there are only a series of unconquerable evil deities that affect the world through, among other things, their human disciples, who can be defeated, but are not always detectable. It is very similar to the propaganda released by both sides in the Catholic Crusade, depicting the other as performing black masses to gain power from Satan, which was the main cause of the European witch hunts. A prevailing theme in Lovecraft's works is that we good, civilized human beings should fear those evil cultists hiding in plain sight, and that we need to stop them before they wake up Cthulhu or other evil gods, and end humanity's reign imposing civility on an illogical, savage reality that to witness it would drive any normal person insane. But it's ultimately hopeless because malevolent cosmic entities will surely destroy us anyway. I wanted to specifically review one Lovecraft short story, Medusa's Coil, which he ghostwrote for Zelia Bishop. To talk about that, though, I have to address his works in general. Even though the story was written for another author, Lovecraft made it his own, to the point of tying in Cthulhu and the cult. The guy was a bit egotistical, and he liked seeding other authors' works with references to his evil gods, to perpetuate the illusion that they would really exist out there in the world. It is necessary to understand Cthulhu and his works in general, to understand Medusa's Coil in its proper context. Lovecraft is much beloved. His works inspired many a horror writer, and there's even a Cthulhu-Con in Oregon. However, he has another side, one that everyone knows, but that his fans don't typically like discussing when they're celebrating his works. The man was a huge racist and general bigot. He didn't like black people, thought that immigrants were ruining America, and despite taking a Jewish wife, had nice things to say about Hitler. That's not fun to think about when you want to run around a convention hall dressed as a space squid and say, Cthulhu Fatagan! But it is a significant part of the man and his legacy. His hateful philosophies cannot be separated from his work, and are, in fact, essential for understanding them. He wasn't writing his stories for the human race to enjoy, just the white race. Everyone who wasn't a white middle-class American like him was the other. In his paranoid bigotry, he associated the other with the evil Cthulhu-worshipping cultists, threatening civilization. It fit in with the white supremacist notion that white Americans were imposing order and civility on non-white savagery, and that this legitimization of people of color would destroy the good, sane world. At its heart, it's racist malarkey. That is what you have to understand when reading Lovecraft. Medusa's Coil is often regarded as Lovecraft's most racist work, to the extent that you can make a drinking game out of every time something racist shows up. Actually, it's so rooted in his outdated bigotry that it can be borderline incomprehensible to modern readers. You have to be a racist to understand why it's supposed to be scary. I typically focus on analyzing gender issues, but for analyzing Medusa's Coil, I would be remiss not to talk about race primarily. The story starts in rural Missouri in the present, circa era 1930s. An everyman protagonist, which is to say a gun-toting white southerner, gets lost while driving around at night. A storm is coming, so he stops for the night at an old run-down plantation house, in which an old neglected white man lives alone. The old guy named Antoine is lonely, so he tells this stranger a story about how he came to be in this condition. This part, Antoine telling the story, makes up the bulk of the short story. Antoine's story starts in the antebellum South, where the plantation, called Riverside, is beautiful and the slaves are happy. Too bad that the Civil War happened and ended that wonderful era. Hey, it's racist already.
That's racist!
He talks about his ancestors owning the place and how awesome it is that they're from good families. This is both classist and racist in context. The racist part will be apparent later. Like a lot of Southerners who care about bloodline purity, Antoine marries his cousin. This is interesting because of how neutrally it's depicted. These days we would find that a weird taboo, but this story's racism is depicted positively. More on that theme later. Antoine's wife cousin dies in childbirth. and he raises his son Dennis on his own. I guess you could say that this is a good, positive depiction of responsible fatherhood, but the whole racism part kind of overshadows it, so yeah. Antoine lavishes praise on his son, including the part about Dennis having high morals for not seeking sexual relations with black women, to whom Antoine refers with the N-word. Dennis grows up and goes to France for higher education. At the time and place, there's a big libertine crowd, but Antoine says that he was a good boy for not joining in. The exact phrasing Lovecraft uses here took me a while to understand, that Dennis didn't cut up with the gayer dogs, which as far as I can tell means something on the order of not having cheeky Nandos with the lads. Dennis, however, does get attracted to a sinister element associated with devil worship. Or, basically, other religions. There's a pagan crowd that he starts hanging out with, which is devil worship according to Antoine. But really, it's other religions. But that's Satan worship to Christians. Antoine doesn't actually believe that the kids are literally contacting Satan, only pretending to, going through the motions out of rebellion. However, Dennis gets involved with a pagan cult that is recognizable as a Cthulhu cult to those familiar with Lovecraft. This cult is associated with ancient Egypt, Tunisia, and Zimbabwe. In other words, the scary, dark-colored people of Africa. Oh no. This cult has a beautiful priestess named Marceline, a woman whose beauty is associated with her ivory skin. Marceline is the principal antagonist, the secondary one being her hair, but I'll get to that. She claims that she's the bastard daughter of some noble. Antoine approves of this because whether or not she's legitimate, it makes her better than those of lesser birth. Ew. Dennis falls for her, or as Antoine describes it, she hypnotizes him, presumably because she thinks that he's far richer than he actually is. Dennis marries her and takes her back to Riverside, and then she gets angry about not having as much power as she envisioned, and makes everybody miserable. This gold digger seductive women trope adds some sexism with the racism. Marceline has black, tightly braided hair that Antoine compares to a snake. There are references to the Medusa in the cult, and Antoine imagines that Marceline's hair has a will of its own. Spoiler warning, it does. Marceline spends hours putting on makeup before anyone sees her in the morning, and she treats her hair with a special oil, and Antoine imagines that she feeds it. Antoine goes on and on about the hair. Hair is evil, the hair. Antoine keeps black servants, who I think are supposed to be the slaves grown up. Of course, they stayed at Riverside because that's their proper place. One of the former slaves is a scary Zulu priestess, who worships Marceline because the Zulu people naturally would worship Cthulhu. And she magically recognizes that she acts as Cthulhu's avatar on Earth, or something. Dennis's college friend Frank Marsh shows up, and apparently falls for Marceline. Marsh says that Marceline is his muse, and wants to paint her nude. Marceline agrees. To reduce tensions, Antoine sends Dennis out of town for a while, until Marsh can finish his painting and leave. Antoine has a debilitating medical condition that he takes painkillers for, and one day he knocks himself out and wakes up to find a murder scene. Marceline is dead, her hair cut off, and bloody footprints and a snake trail lead out of the room. Antoine follows them to Dennis, who explains that he snapped out of Marceline's spell, saw her as evil, and then came home early. He walked in on Marsh painting her and killed her, but her hair attacked Marsh and killed him. Dennis then tries to kill the hair, but it kills him. Antoine hides their bodies and concocts a likely story about them dying in a war, but the hair is still out there, threatening everyone. And Marceline lives on through the painting. The black servants are scared away, and Antoine becomes the hermit that we know him as in the present. He finishes his story, and then asks the protagonist if he wants to see the painting. He agrees, so they go to the room, and Antoine unveils the thing. The protagonist is horrified by it. Marsh didn't just paint Marceline, he painted the evil he saw through her. Behind her, he painted Whatever. The undersea city in which Cthulhu sleeps, which is pure insanity with geometry that doesn't make sense, not quite goat things, and alligators with tentacles, which doesn't sound very scary. You've got an Escher painting with satyrs and goofy animals. But to Lovecraft, this was the heart of terror. It is pretty much the other in its purest form, a world of other populated with others. That was his bigoted nightmare. The protagonist sees the painted figure of Marceline move, and reflexively he draws his gun and fires on it. America. However, this causes Marceline to rise from the grave and come after them with her hair snake. In the effort to escape, the house catches fire and burns to the ground. The protagonist narrowly gets away, but Antoine is doomed. The protagonist then pops out of a time bubble, where he finds out that the house burned down years prior. And then comes the most racist part of the story. The protagonist describes something else that he saw in that painting, something truly horrifying, something that he can't bear to let the neighbors know, because it's too hideous to share. This is the thing that terrified Antoine years ago, and it stays with the protagonist now. I'm talking about true terror! Are you ready? The twist is, and I quote, Marceline was a negress.
Holy shit! Oh my god!
Yeah, that's the huge twist at the end. The wham line meant to horrify. Apparently she was wearing white makeup to give her that beautiful ivory skin. The idea of a white man marrying a black woman was so repulsive to Lovecraft that he actually wrote it as horror, equivalent to finding out about evil gods. The reader is supposed to be left unsettled, disgusted at the idea that a black woman could trick a white man like that. It's actually written like one of those Japanese folk tales about evil foxes pretending to be human women to seduce men and steal them away. It's a fear of the other manipulating you into loving it and inviting it into your bed when it's actually the other and not your lover or whatever. This racism is really alien to readers of today, but the same basic bigoted concept can be found today in transphobia. Transphobes delegitimize trans women's identities and perceive them as gay men, and a result of that is fear that trans women trying to sleep with cis men are gay men tricking them by putting on a female disguise. The Family Guy episode where Brian vomits after finding out that he was attracted to a trans woman is pretty much the same as Medusa's Coil, just with a different minority swapped in. Things have improved since Lovecraft's day, but this generation hasn't gotten over that same bigoted idea. It's still present in a different form. Knowing that Marceline is black, we can consider that line about Dennis being a good boy who doesn't pursue black women to be racist foreshadowing, and it gives greater significance to her hair. Black people's hair is different from white people's hair, and the difference has been politicized. Black people have been pressured to use chemicals to force their hair to look like white people's, which is what Marceline feeding her hair alludes to. But starting around the 1960s, there has been a growing movement for black people to be proud of their natural hair, which is the good approach. But Lovecraft went with the awful approach of describing Marceline's hair as evil every chance he got. It's not just the idea that the hair is alive, it's that her strange black hair is to be feared and also alive. It's different, so it's evil. The story has a fixation on her hair and how strange and scary it is, and this is rooted in Lovecraft's fear and hatred of black people. In Medusa's Coil, black people are either evil or naive simpletons. The whole Cthulhu cult thing is associated with African religions. The fact that Marceline is black indicates that she has a special connection to African religions, and thus Cthulhu. I'm not just making that conclusion, that is laid out plainly in the last paragraph. The Zulu priestess also mourns her death by asking for Cthulhu to rise and take vengeance. Because her religion is totally the Cthulhu religion, yeah. The black servants, who are either the former slaves or descendants of the former slaves, are innocent, but in the childlike way that slaves were depicted in the antebellum South. Not as full people. They need to be taken care of and brought to civility by their white masters. Or the human race needs to bring the Cthulhu world to civility. Same thing. Classic white supremacy. Lovecraft might have been good with turning a phrase and building tension, but he was absolutely horrible at social issues. In many ways, he represents everything that should be opposed. There is actually an idea I've seen passed around that based on his philosophies being so wrong, Cthulhu rising wouldn't be that bad. His idea of insanity might just be the negative effect of intolerant people having to deal with a world that has things they don't like in it. Oh my god, people who don't look like me exist and they think they have legitimacy, yeah! What Lovecraft viewed as the destruction of civilization might be best for everyone. The human race will change, but maybe for the better, ascending into a polyamorous transhuman utopia where racism and classism no longer exist. I say Cthulhu Fatagan! Rise, rise!